Okay, Vergil Ortiz versus Michael Mckinson. The only fight other than the main event that I saw in this card was Maurice Hooker versus Blair Cobbs. So to talk about that briefly, I saw Blair Cobbs, and this was the first time I've seen Blair Cobbs in his previous fight against Alexis Rocha. I wasn't impressed with what I saw in the Alexis Rocha fight. His style works best if you are a superior athlete. Now, when I say superior, that's a relative term for boxing, because compare Blair Cobbs to the average person and he's a superior athlete. But compare Blair Cobbs to Jaron Ennis, and he's not a superior athlete, is he? He's inferior to a Jaron Ennis, inferior, in my view, to an Errol Spence, a Terence Crawford, a Keith Thurman, etc., in terms of his athleticism. So he fights like a guy who should have the athleticism of Keith Thurman, but doesn't. And that cost him against Alexis Rocha. At the end of the day, he's only doing as well as he can do, and I think he's a somewhat limited fighter, Blair Cobbs, at world level. So he bounced back from that first career defeat, and he is 32 years of age, Blair Cobbs, which is always a red flag for guys at this kind of age, right? He was, whatever he was, 15-0 going into the, or 14, 15-0 going into the Rocha fight. At 31, 32, you wonder what on earth this guy's been doing his whole career to only just be moving into world title contention at this age. That's usually indicative of a fighter not being that good, you know, at this weight division at least. A heavyweight is a bit different, maybe cruiserweight, but in the welters, nah, man, especially in America, if you're that good, you would have been in world title contention long before you're 32 in most instances. And that's what I saw in that Rocha fight. A guy who was pretty limited, but tries to fight like he's athletically gifted. So he comes back against Maurice Hooker, who of course has moved up in weight. He's been a world champion before, but he's a bit long in the tooth now. Apparently, he was dealing with some personal issues going into this fight. I think his mom died or something like that. And he definitely seemed like he wasn't at his most focused, Maurice Hooker. I'm not using that as an excuse. Perhaps even if he was 100% focused, he still would have lost. Maybe it's a stylistic thing. Maybe it's the thing whereby Maurice Hooker has just moved up too many weight divisions at this stage. In any event, Blair Cobbs was able to drop him several times in the fight. He was able to outbox him. And in the second half of the fight, Hooker started applying a lot more pressure and actually bust Blair Cobbs' face up. He was cut. He had a swollen eye. And if you hadn't seen the fight and you just saw both of their faces after the final bell, you would, most people would assume, that Maurice Hooker was actually the winner. But no, Blair Cobbs managed to do damage early with his long-range boxing, the southpaw left hand, etc. Drop Maurice Hooker, build up a lead whereby he was able to get through the final part of the fight where he was under some pretty intense pressure from Maurice Hooker. Not the most effective pressure you've seen. Hooker was really struggling to pin Blair Cobbs down. Cobbs moving around and just making himself an awkward target, really running in the latter stages of the fight. He had his track shoes on and he was running, but he did what he needed to do at the end of the day. He got through and he got the win. And he was apparently something like a 3-1 underdog going into this fight. So that's a real great result for Blair Cobbs, particularly coming off a loss. So congratulations to him. But in terms of his prospects at welterweight, I don't think they're that great. The division is very, very strong. Anyway, moving up the card, if we just click here, Vergil Ortiz Jr. versus Michael Mckinson. This is a fight that got rescheduled. They were even talking about having Vergil Ortiz fight somebody else rather than Mckinson, but eventually it got sorted out, and it was for the WBO International Welterweight title. I believe this served as an eliminator for the WBO World title, which is held by Terence Crawford. Correct me if I'm wrong. Pretty sure Bud holds the WBO. You get confused sometimes with the alphabet soup. Ortiz versus Mckinson. Now, I think that Mckinson boxed as good a fight as he could box, as a guy of his kind of ability could box. Some people were saying that Mckinson held his ground too much and that he should have moved a lot more and tried to be more slick. I think the philosophy of Mckinson was that if I just run around the ring from the opening bell, they're not going to give me a decision in, Vergil Ortiz's backyard in Texas. They're not going to give me a decision here. And also, I'm just delaying the inevitable. Because moving around on the back foot, this guy's not going to respect me. Mckinson's already only got 2 or 3 knockouts in his whole career in 22 fights. So I think he felt as though he had to make a stand early. Not recklessly, but I think he felt like he had to land some clean shots, walk Ortiz into some clean shots to make him know that actually there is some power there. He's not a puncher, but if you're reckless, if you have no respect at all, he's going to hit you with something that's going to get your attention. I think that's what Mckinson's game plan was, because Vergil Ortiz is a guy who will build up a head of steam in applying pressure. And once that head of steam gets to a certain level, you're just going to get railroaded. So Mckinson, I imagine, felt as though he had to give Ortiz something to think about early so that he wouldn't build up that head of steam, or that he could at least delay the head of steam and pick up some early rounds. I want to say the first round might have been Mckinson's only round. And even then, he came dangerously close to getting clipped with big shots. As the fight progressed, Ortiz was the one landing the cleaner shots. Mckinson was landing the odd shot here and there, but Ortiz was landing the more memorable shots. He looked the more dangerous. He was digging to Mckinson's body, and you did think, those body shots were landing clean. You were thinking, it's only a matter of time before they're going to take their toll. So there was an air, at least for me, of inevitability. In fact, I was surprised watching the fight that Mckinson lasted as long as he did. He lasted until the 9th. When we were in maybe the 2nd, 3rd round, I was thinking, this fight's going to be over in a round or 2. Mckinson's getting clipped too much in the body and with the headshots. But Mckinson evidently is a very, very tough guy. And when you have such little power, you need to be tough in order even to reach this level where you're fighting top contenders. Yeah, you have to be tough to reach this level when you've got no power. And evidently Mckinson is not just physically tough, but mentally tough, because you're used to not knocking guys out. You're used to having to deal with guys for the whole 10 or 12 rounds, coming at you, hitting you, hurting you, etc. So Mckinson certainly proved tough mentally and physically, but ultimately it wasn't enough. He got hit with a body shot in the 8th round. He went down. He was gasping for air. He got up and he was circling the ring perimeter, running around trying to survive. He seemingly didn't recover in between the 8th and the 9th, because as soon as he came out for the 9th, it appeared as though he didn't even get hit but went down again. I don't know whether it was the residual effects from that body shot in the previous round, or whether it was actually Michael Mckinson quitting, whether it was Michael Mckinson showing distress signals to his corner, hoping that his corner would throw in the towel, which of course they did. Because after he got up from seemingly not getting hit, but he still received the count, he started limping around the ring. The referee allowed it to continue. He started limping, and that is when his corner threw the towel in. Now, I didn't see him limping in the previous round. I didn't see him limping when he came out. It was very brief, but when he came out for the 9th, I didn't notice any limping. It was only when he got up, or actually when when he got up from the knockdown and he started moving around, towards the end of him moving around, you saw a little bit of limping, and then the corner threw in the towel. So I'm not accusing Michael Mckinson of quitting, by the way. I'm just verbalizing my thought process. In my head, it was either the body shot had completely crippled him, and he was so weak that when he came out for the next round, he just had to flop on the floor because he was in so much pain. And he was so weakened by the shot. It's either that, or he basically was sending distress signals to the corner so that they'd rescue him because he didn't want to continue. One or the other in my head. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below. I don't think Mckinson could have done any more. If he'd come out and been negative from the opening bell, I think he would have had probably an even tougher time. And ultimately, Mckinson was trying to win. So even if he came out and just ran around the ring, he didn't think he could win that way. And he was probably right in terms of, trying to pick up a decision when you're fighting that negatively. But on the flip side, you could say, well, if he'd run around the ring and fought negatively the whole night, but went the distance, his stock might have been higher because Ortiz didn't stop him. You see what I'm saying? And he would have been the first person to take Vergil Ortiz the 12-round distance because prior to this, it'd only been 8 rounds. Well, he partly achieved some of that goal, or achieved part of that goal because, again, Ortiz had only been 8 rounds previous. Mckinson extended him into the 9th round, but, it's not much longer than it'd been in a previous fight. So, yeah, I think Mckinson did as good as he could do, a guy of that kind of ability, a Paulie Malignaggi type fighter in the sense that, yeah, he can box and he's tough because he has to be like Malignaggi had to be tough. And when I say have to be tough, there's only a certain amount of choice in the matter. If you are someone that has an Amir Khan chin, no amount of will in the world is going to give you a Marvin Hagler chin. You understand? So when I say have to be tough, I'm saying that the fighters who have no power, like Mckinson or Malignaggi, who actually make it to world title level, are the ones that are really tough. Because the ones who can't punch and also aren't that tough are never going to get to that level. That's what I'm saying, in case anyone's confused here. So, yeah, that was my take on the fight. Now, Vergil Ortiz moving forward, of course, they're talking about him fighting the likes of Bud Crawford. I don't see him beating Bud Crawford. Ortiz reminds me somewhat of a young Miguel Cotto. He doesn't seem to have the back foot game, or at least I haven't seen him demonstrate the back foot game of a Miguel Cotto yet. But coming forward, he's somewhat reminiscent of Miguel Cotto. The way he throws his punches, his body position, and so on. He's somewhat reminiscent. He's not exactly like him. There are differences there, but there are a lot of similarities too. It remains to be seen whether he'll be as successful as Cotto. But in the division right now, I wouldn't pick Vergil Ortiz over Terence Crawford. I wouldn't pick him over Errol Spence. I personally wouldn't pick him over Jaron Ennis. I think Ennis would beat Vergil Ortiz at this stage. I might pick him over Keith Thurman, maybe. Not sure exactly how much Keith Thurman has left, but I might pick him over Thurman. Vergil Ortiz versus Conor Benn. I was listening to or watching Chris Andre's video, and Chris Andre was basically making out as though Conor Benn isn't as far off the level of Vergil Ortiz as a lot of people seem to think, because there's this narrative in Britain that Conor Benn is just this hype job, this matchroom creation, and if you put him in there against even a David Abanesian, he'd get found out, never mind a Vergil Ortiz. Whereas I tend to concur with Chris Andre. I tend to agree with him. I think Conor Benn is maybe a bit better than his critics in the UK are giving him credit for. He hasn't fought at a particularly high level yet, but I suspect that Conor Benn is actually up there in terms of punch and power with the likes of Vergil Ortiz. I'm not saying he punches as hard or harder, and I'm not saying that Ortiz punches harder than Benn, but I think he's in the same ballpark, to be honest with you, in terms of punch and power. And Conor Benn's a more explosive puncher, I would say. You know, his punches come whipping in faster than Vergil Ortiz. Ortiz, part of his effectiveness as a puncher, part of the reason he's got a high knockout percentage is because he's accurate and he connects cleanly. I don't know whether the brute force behind Ortiz's punches. Is that spectacular? He's a puncher, of course. But I think a lot of his effectiveness as a puncher comes from the accuracy, the timing, and how clean he lands, rather than there just being a brute force, behind the shots. Like George Foreman was a brute force puncher. He didn't have to land that clean in order to hurt you. He'd hurt you through the gloves. Do you know what I mean? One of them kind of guys. Whereas other fighters, they can hit, but they don't have that kind of brute force. They more rely on their accuracy, landing clean, timing, speed, and so on. With Vergil Ortiz, I think there's a large element of that there. Conor Benn, just based upon the eye test, seems to have more velocity on his shots, on his big power shots that he whips in. And he really anchors his feet to the canvas and tries to get maximum leverage when he's cranking these big right hands and left hooks and all this kind of thing. So, yeah, I think Vergil Ortiz is a good fighter, contender now. But based upon what I've seen so far, I wouldn't put him in the top. Definitely wouldn't put him in the top three. The top three in my head are obviously Spence and Crawford, but number 3 might be Jaron Ennis. He hasn't proven himself to be the number 3 yet, Jaron Ennis. Don't get it twisted. I'm talking about what I suspect to be the case in my head. I'm not saying that this is my list and Jaron Ennis is 3. I'm not saying that. I'm talking about in my head, if I'm to, take a punt at what the top 3 might be based upon how good I think Ennis could be rather than what he's actually proven, he might be number 3. With Vergil Ortiz 4, maybe Keith Thurman 5, something like that. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below. I know there are a lot of people out there who are very high on Vergil Ortiz who probably think it's blasphemous for me to even mention Conor Benn in the same sentence as this guy. But I've seen several of his fights now, including against Maurice Hooker, of course. Hooker, who was stopped by... Let's go back and look at Hooker's career. Stopped by Ortiz, yes, but also stopped by Ramirez at 140. You guys remember that fight? Stopped by Ramirez at 140. So, yeah, I've seen several of Vergil Ortiz's fights, and while I think he's good, he hasn't shown me what Ennis has shown me so far. The thing about Ennis, though, this is my one reservation about him, is that he's so talented that he might be prone to complacency. Because some guys who have that amount of natural ability can have that deficiency about them, where they maybe don't train as, not that he's not a hard trainer, I'm sure Jaron Ennis trains hard, but guys who are not as athletically gifted as Ennis, which is the majority, they go the extra mile in terms of honing their technique, in terms of honing their defense, their positioning, formulating their strategies. They leave no stone unturned. They dot every T and cross every I. Do you know what I mean? Whereas sometimes these guys with this incredible ability like Ennis, they feel like they can go into fights without dotting every T and without crossing every I. Because even if they encounter some resistance or some issues, they can just turn it up a notch because they got so many gears, because they're so athletically gifted. You see what I'm saying? That's my one reservation about Ennis. And obviously we haven't seen Ennis in a real tough fight. We haven't seen his chin tested. We haven't seen his heart tested. And we need to see that. We haven't seen him in there against a real good boxer. Right? So there are plenty of questions about Ennis to be answered. But he's one of these guys who's, at least for my money, whose physical ability is so impressive. And he's so big for the weight. I mean, Ennis is massive for a welterweight. He dwarfs all these guys he gets in the ring with. And he's got a massive reach too. It's not that he's just tall, like whatever he is, 5'11", 6 foot. There's been taller welterweights than that, of course. But of the current crop, Ennis must be one of the tallest, the 5'10", 5'11", whatever he is. I think he's one of the tallest of the current crop. His reach is like 75 inches. That's longer than Bud Crawford's reach. And Crawford's got a crazy long reach. So he's just physically, he looks like a 154 pounder. you know? And you combine that with his athleticism and his speed and his power and his everything about him, I think he would be too much for Vergil Ortiz at this stage. But Bud Crawford and Errol Spence, they're different. They would ask a lot more questions, at least in my head, of Jaron Ennis. Anyway, I should probably have made a separate video about Ennis. But that's my thoughts on Vergil Ortiz and his win over Michael Mckinson and where he goes from here. I was also watching a Dwyer video where he was talking about what's next for Terence Crawford and Errol Spence. If they can't get it together in an undisputed unification fight, then they're going to have to fight the likes of Vergil Ortiz, even Conor Benn, and of course Jaron Ennis. And in a way, that's not a bad consolation prize at all, is it? Of course, we want to see the Terence Crawford, Errol Spence fight. But if we were to get Terence Crawford versus Vergil Ortiz instead, and Errol Spence versus Jaron Ennis, would you really be complaining that much? Do you know what I mean? So that's still a good consolation prize. Very, very interesting times in the welterweight division. So let me know what you guys think in the comments below.